Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. So on this episode, I'm going to talk about some of my favourite embodiment teachers in the whole wide world. The idea here is not that just to pick out individuals. You know, there's lots of people I haven't studied with and I've got personal biases. The idea here is to draw out what made them really good teachers. So it's not so much that they were great dancers or martial artists, whatever it was, but there was something about them that was excellent in teaching. So the idea here is I want to draw out, through all these different examples I'm going to give, what makes someone particularly good at passing on embodiment to others, teaching, facilitating that whole area. It doesn't imply that I have sort of close personal relationship with all of them. Some of them I maybe just saw once or briefly. Some of them may not even like me, but many of them, I have known well. And of course, there's lots and lots of people that aren't included who may be very, very good teachers. So while I'm going to playfully call this, I think, something like the best embodiment teachers, the key thing here is high quality embodiment teaching. That's my obsession. That's what I spend my time trying to pass on is not just teaching yoga or embodiment, but actually teaching people to teach it. Pretty obsessed with that. When I started EFC, Frankie, my colleague, and I sat down and said, we need some standards by which we can evaluate embodiment teachers that go across different disciplines, because some of our students were dancers, some were body therapists, some were martial artists, a lot were life coaches. So we needed something that was really relevant to all these different areas, rather than just saying, it's all good. Actually, I think it's kind of dishonest, right, when people say that, because you can go to a better or worse yoga class. Actually, the wife of a friend of mine came to look at a Aikido day that some of us were doing, and she immediately was able to pick out the person that was best at Aikido in the room. Now, that was just a performance, perhaps, but then in teaching as well, I think this is common sense. But exactly why some people may be good teachers or not, what does that really mean to be a good teacher? Let's go into that, some of the specifics. I can go through a whole list of things that I've found that it means over the years from working with this, doing lots and lots of teaching myself, studying teaching as an art. But I think, some examples will really draw it out. And mostly I'm going to go for good practice. I'm not going to talk about every terrible embodiment teacher I've ever had. Let me start, though, with some things that weren't so good. So some of my first experiences were with Aikido, martial arts, and some very heavily Japanese influenced people. And the methodology there wasn't really one. It was just that you had to copy the teacher, and things weren't really broken down or explained. Movements weren't done many times. It was very quick. And it was really difficult to learn from some of these high-level teachers that I was around. And on the one hand, it was like, wow, these guys are amazing. They're really top-level people. But I'd say it's more of like a cultural barrier there, because there's different cultural styles of learning. And perhaps in Japan that might work with Japanese people who have been, trained to observe for many years and have a different kind of tolerances, different emotions in ways different from we do as people in the West. But it certainly wasn't very good for me, and I learned very, very little. And I actually ended up learning more from sort of the new black belt than the 5th degree black belt. This is often the way in martial arts or any discipline. And that showed me it's not always the person who's the best at the art who's the best teaching it, because this other younger guy was able to explain things, to break it down, sort of tell me in scientific language that I understood, took time with me, and he was the person I actually learned most from in the Aikido club. And certainly, I wasted many, many days with a Japanese teacher, just kind of looking at them and not being able to get it. And there's this kind of kudos of like, yeah, I'm in the room with the big Japanese sensei. That must mean I'm getting it. It's going to somehow rub off on me. And that just wasn't the case. And of course, there's things to be learned there. Like I was learning to observe. I was learning to take responsibility for my own learning rather than putting it all on the teacher. That's a big difference, actually, between East and West. The martial arts say you have to steal the technique. and the emphasis is on the student. If you don't get it, then, well, bad luck. That's your problem. And maybe in the West, we put too much emphasis on the opposite. It's like the teacher has to get it by. And you see this in schools, if it's like, there's no bad students anymore. There's only bad teachers. And, maybe it can go too far that way. But for me, there's some sort of healthy balance of joint responsibility. I learned in those early days that just being good at something wasn't the same as being able to convey it while I was doing that. So that was my initial foray into the martial arts. If I was to keep going with the martial arts, I could mention Shihan William Smith. So he was someone that very traditionalist guy. So he had the sort of old school teaching methods, but there was a real patience there, a real care, a real kind of nobility, a real sense that if you're his student that you were cared for, even though it was in some ways still quite traditional kind of style teaching. And, that appealed to me a lot. And the other thing I really learned from him was learning from example. So this is someone who in their day-to-day bearing, their day-to-day manner was very positive, very dignified, treated people well, well-mannered, kind of imagine sort of English gentleman type style. And, that's what I learned from him and many other Aikido teachers. I was what's called Ichideshi, which is a kind of like an apprentice. It means inside the door, often living with the student teachers or being very close to them, carrying their bags, and it's a lot of that process as a student is learning to put yourself second, is learning to observe, learning to be tuned into someone, which is very helpful, but also just sort of seeing them day to day, and for me, that's where a good teacher shows up as much, not just when they're in front of the room in the workshop or the dance studio or whatever it is, but also when they're, just tying their shoes, when they're talking to the person in the coffee shop, when they're, hugging their wife goodbye as you pick them up to go out for a course. That's where you can really learn from a person. I think some of my Aikido teachers, people like William Smith, his son Philip Smith, Gordon Jones, it was as much about how they were off the mat as on it. Yeah, and, how things are broken down, the sort of that scientific approach. Philip Smith will get on the show, actually. He definitely had that going on. And it's another one with a sense of humour. So I really like that. It's Tom Helsby is another teacher of mine who has a sense of humour. That's something I think with a teacher is extremely helpful. Also balance. I'm thinking of two Aikido teachers I still train with, actually, Tom and Maria Helsby, and they're quite different in their personalities. One's very technical and breaks things down. One's much more philosophical and poetic. And both of those things have a place. And sometimes you see them in the same teacher. In this case, they're a married couple who teach together or, teach different days of the week. And, Tom will be very philosophical and bring in quotes from the Tao Te Ching or, some sort of classic. And Maria will be laying very technical angles and left foot and right foot. And I think a good teacher or a good teaching team in this case needs both of those things, both the very concrete and the slightly bigger picture, more poetic, more abstract. Obviously, people learn in different ways. So, it can be important to have both of those. On the Aikido front, who else we got? Jamie Zimron we had on the show. She's a very good teacher, very smart. Patrick Cassidy and Miles Kessler, they're two teachers I really like in the Aikido. Well, we've had Miles on the show. And they really bring it to a different level in terms of like the depth of practice that it comes from and the breadth of understanding, like the sense that the teacher has the big picture of things, I think is really important, not just they're teaching you a technical thing. And we'll come on to this with a lot of these teachers is presence. Someone like Miles has done a lot of work on himself, done a lot of years of sitting and hard training, and that presence, that embodiment is what he's conveying, and that comes through. So there's different levels of teaching, right? There's the level of teaching which is like, okay, here's a technique you can learn, but there's also the manner. I talked about the sort of seeing them in daily life, and more than that, we can talk about state transmission. I remember when I was in the room with a Junpo, this Zen teacher, and I just completely started spacing out because I was just getting too much kind of transmission of his general way of mental consciousness, and I just wasn't able to handle it at the time. And that can be, in that case, it was almost too much. But often, it's just being a little bit calmer than your students. It's being a little bit more, your attention being a little bit more trained. Many of the people I'm talking about, there's different kinds of presence. Someone like Paul Linden, one of my main mentors, who's been on the show, he has loving presence. This continuous loving presence. And, I soon learned, I within about sort of 5 years of studying with Paul, I'd got a pretty good handle on his techniques because they're fairly simple. And I'd be teaching them and not getting the same result as him. And I was thinking, what's going on with that? I'm pretty smart and I've learned this. And of course, I wasn't bringing the weight of experience. Now, some of that's pure projection. He's a little old guy and everyone knows he's done it for 45 years. So he gets kind of positive projections. And, as a younger guy, people might not feel so safe with you. But it's actually more than that. There's a real loving presence to Paul that's tangible. And people like being around that loving presence. To do deep transformative work, people have to feel safe. They have to have this sense of safety, of going, okay, this person has my best interests at heart. And we all have that to a degree, and to another degree there's a part of us which is all like, well, actually I just sort of want to get paid and go home, or just want to, the ego part of it, or whatever it is. If we're honest, that's always in there. And where that kind of loving presence is really dominating, and I've seen this Comey teaches body therapy school, which really stresses this as well. That is the key thing. It's like I've seen teachers that have that do very simple techniques and get massive results. And all deep embodied work is done with trust, right? So without trust, you can't do anything. And that's often what I'm trying to do with a new group, is build a sense of authority and trust. And this kind of like warmth and power as two sides of the same thing. Some teachers have a lot of the power, might call it charisma or gravitas. There's a teacher called Richard Strozzi Heckler who's got a lot of that. He walks into a room and it's like, wow, here's someone that's got oomph. Miles has that too. That sense of depth, that there's a mile between someone's front and their back. That power, that gravitas. And sometimes it's, structural, or maybe it's projected. But my sense is that actually that's there in their being. Sometimes it's just how calm they are. They're the only one who's calm and everyone else is losing their head. So a lot of the teachers I'm talking about have that, or the sort of maybe sort of slightly warmer side of it, and it's two sides of the same thing, but tends to be it predominates one side or the other. Someone's defined charisma actually as warmth plus power, and those two sides of it. Now, I think the danger of charisma is kind of people do what you want, even if you're not really making sense or you're suggesting something less useful. There's lots of studies on business people actually to say that charisma is not always a good thing for company leaders, because people go along with them and end up doing things that aren't so smart. And we see that in history as well. But a certain amount of this gravitas, this particularly with the loving presence, I think is massive. I remember Paul was actually staying at mine once, and I had a little tiny flat back then. He was in my room, and I was just like on the stairs outside, because it's the only place to sleep. And he's a fairly old guy, and he woke up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet. And he's on medication for his Parkinson's, so he's sometimes, a little dazed and confused at certain parts of his med cycle. And he kind of tripped over me, and he didn't know where he was. He wasn't aware that he was in England. He's from the States, and he didn't know who I was. But he was just incredibly kind and loving. He was like, "Oh, where am I? Who are you? You seem nice, And it was at that moment I already went, yeah, I want this guy as my mentor. Because it was like, even when he was in the middle of the night, didn't know who he was, didn't kind of know who he was maybe, there was still that sort of base of loving presence. And, that can, some people I think have that sort of more naturally. There's a NVC teacher called Giano Shaw, and she really just has that like oozing out of her. She's like this kind of like mother, there's different flavors of it. Like with her, it's like the sort of earth mother kind of figure. Other people, I know Paul has told me, he really had to work on it. I know it's something I work on over the years. And the opposite of that would be, for example, like if a little bit of contempt comes into my voice and my face and my embodiment, maybe I'm tired and I start being kind of thinking judgmentally to a student, like, oh, this person's pissing me off, losing my patience, as, we all got a limit. And, that people really pick up on. And that's kind of the opposite of that. And that's kind of learning edge for me right now. And obviously I'm not like, contemptful of my students all the time or anything, but there's, anything less than saintly in his work to do, right? So yeah. Okay, so completely different one. Jose Bueno, his name is Jose, his Portuguese name, so it's Jose, not Jose. He's from Brazil, and I lived with him for a while and stayed at his dojo for a while. And Jose does martial arts like it was dancing salsa. He's imagine a sort of stereotypical Brazilian. His name means Mr. Good, Jose Mourinho Brenner, the good sea. And he's very kind of charming and playful. He's all in the hips. And, his dojo was full of people like kind of like they'd party and there'd be beers in the fridge. And, they still train hard, but it was like the first time I saw that like this whole embodiment thing could really be like celebratory. I was just with an Italian teacher actually at a yoga festival, and it's partly cultural, I think, because he had this same vibe. It was just like, enjoy your yoga, be pleasurable in your yoga. And that sense of enjoying life that sense of taking pleasure in life, that sense that it need not be some sort of hardcore chore, is definitely something I saw with Jose, the kind of pleasure and flow side of things. And I've seen several Italian teachers as well that have that. So it's definitely a cultural element there. And I try and bring a bit of that into my work. Obviously, playfulness, that's something that some of the improv teachers that I've seen have. But interestingly, like if I think of like Rachel Blackman, who's on the show, or Liz Peters, another improv teacher I've worked with, or John Kramer, yes, they're super playful and it's great to have that. But the key thing there again is they're in the moment, the real, and it might not look silly when a more, say, corporate embodiment teacher has this, but that genuinely being present and responding in the moment. So, an okay embodiment teacher will have a plan and it matches the group and they'll go through it. But a really good one is just continuously tuned into the needs of the group. And that's what I think some of the improv people can do really well. I had Adam on the show. He's another one that can do that very well. That really being tuned into the moment. And then the sort of the magic happens. That's where the magic happens as a teacher, is not having it all worked out in advance and having a good plan to get you there. Adam Barley, we had on the show, Fire Rhythms teacher. He's another one that can really be like present to a room, and you see him and he's just really there. And he's got music he might play, but he's a Fire Rhythms teacher, so he's playing tunes. He picks the one that makes the most sense in that moment. And he might even cut it short or, change the whatever on the music to do that. That kind of quality of presence and responsiveness, whether it's an improv teacher who's teaching that or a Fire Rhythms teacher who's being tuned in. I think for me that is one of the sort of higher level skills. That actually responding to the moment rather than just going through, this is how I've worked it out. Who else have I got on my list? So we talked about Strozzi being charismatic, having that kind of authority, clarity. That's another one I like with Strozzi. I think this is perhaps one more, if I'm going to very gently toot my own trumpet for a while, that the clarity of thinking, it's definitely not the only one. All the things I've mentioned previously are perhaps more important, but having real clarity of concepts, like sometimes it's just like, what are you trying to teach right now? Like I've been in lots of classes with dance movement therapy teachers, particularly, or yoga teachers, where I've gone, well, what are you actually trying to get across? Like, what is the purpose of this? This is one of the exam criteria we have on EFC, is, what is the aim of what you're doing? And recently I just critiqued 4 kind of test exam sessions for EFC, 2 in Russia and 2 in the UK. And I think only one of them had a really clear, like, this is what you're going to get from this session. Yeah, a lot of it follows that. And I know there's other ways to work, but that's, if you're working in business, you definitely need that. What is the purpose of what you're trying to do right now? That's something that can feel kind of, in air quotes, masculine, I think is missing in a lot of embodiment teachers, and some of the ones I really like have that. And Paul Linden will come at it, as he says, a plate full of spaghetti. So with him it's all kind of circular, and he has this sort of Jewish storytelling way of doing things. It's a mixture of it actually comes from a comic, Pogo, and Jewish storytelling tradition, where you kind of come at things sideways and surprisingly say, that's totally valid too. It doesn't have to be linear, but he's always very clear, like what he's actually trying to do under that chaos. It's not always apparent to people until they get to know him. I also just like teachers who are really into what they do. Teachers who are clearly like utterly geeky on what they do. I think that infectiousness really plays off. I'm thinking of Dylan Newcomb, who will get on the show, who's one of the top embodiment teachers in the world today, in my opinion. He's not kind of one of the old grey heads, but he's I wouldn't say a rising star, but like me, so established without being super experienced. And Dylan, is just such a kind of geek for what he does. He's got the cognitive clarity, but also just this like super infectious enthusiasm. He just wants to keep going and keep going. And you see that in a lot of teachers. I mean, it can be a flaw in some. They don't actually take breaks, or they don't give people enough. I was in one workshop the other day, I went for like 3 or 4 hours without a break. And it was like, man, people need the toilet if nothing else. Cigarettes, coffee, it's hard to learn if there's people's addictions are getting in the way. But that general enthusiasm like Dylan has and Paul has, that's Jose, that's one I'd really go for. Thinking of other teachers I've had, there's one guy called Don Levine who was a big mentor for me, and he was just super kind of cognitively intelligent. He was also kind of mischievous. Paul has this, a few of my teachers have this, I have this. There's something about a quality of mischievousness that, like, not taking it all so seriously. Some of the Americans, particularly, who aren't from the Jewish tradition, I had a lot of Jewish teachers, actually. Interesting relationship to Judaism and embodiment. Just an aside, it seems to be sort of less disembodied as a religion than Christianity or Islam or even Hinduism or Buddhism. There's a different relationship to the body, like, you know, having sex on the Sabbath and stuff. But anyway, as an aside, like, Don and had this cheekiness to him, which was kind of naughty, and I think that can offset this sort of very po-faced seriousness that we see in the embodiment world at times. And also, you know, he could be fast and he could be sharp. And like a lot of the time I see teachers coming out of this very kind of baby boomer Californian tradition who are sort of slightly wet rags and very soft. And that's, you know, it's one way of doing things. But I like teachers like Jumpo, the Zen teacher I talked about, or Don, who could be a bit manic, or, you know, who can be a bit sharp, or who can be a bit direct. You know, I think that's a skill which is really worth cultivating. It's certainly not all about being nicey. Who else have I seen that's quite direct like that? You know, I've had some Aikido teachers, obviously, that were pretty direct at times. It's fairly rare. I've seen it in a couple of meditation teachers, not many dance teachers. It's fairly rare, but that ability to be direct without being abusive. Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, I mean, I've only had a very brief experience of her, but there was a mastery of touch. Bruce Furtman has this, there's an Alexander technique there, but Bonnie really had it. You know, I was trying to understand what she meant by a kind of yin touch, and she just kind of touched me and my whole body kind of transformed. It'd been absolute coup if we can get her on the show. But founder of Body Mind Centering, that's Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. But it was the mastery of the kind of touch element to it. I mean, it's easy to talk a good talk and maybe listen to all these podcasts and, you know, start getting an intellectual sense of what is embodiment, but to be able to lay your hands on someone as Paul Linden can, or Bonnie can, or Bruce Furtman can, and do sort of transformative body work through touch, I think that's, you know, that's got to be part of what it means to be a good embodiment teacher. And again, that's part of my learning edge is is doing that. Let me bring out another sort of wildcard example here. So good teachers will have this, but I actually saw this recently. A student of mine just is absolutely impeccable with their sexuality. Now, obviously, any good teacher's not abusive, you know, doesn't sleep with their students. It bugs me when I see, you know, Aikido teachers or yoga teachers, for example, taking advantage of students that way, because of the power dynamic that's involved in there if we're doing deep work. So obviously there's basic sort of ethical hygiene involved, and you know, Paul Linden, my teacher for me, has been the standard for that. He's worked in abuse recovery, and you just have to be really careful in that field in terms of things like boundaries or dual relationships. So there's the ethical side of things, but it can be way more subtle than that. You know, this student of mine the other day, just something really, really impressed me. You know, I just saw her and realised she's a very beautiful young woman, but she never used her sexuality in a kind of manipulative or transactional way. But she was very alive in her sexuality. So she'd sort of skip about and be aware, you know, she's clearly aware of herself as a woman, and comments she would make would bring that out. The sexuality wasn't repressed in her, but even the slightest inkling that it was, you know, not misusing it. And I think I do see people on a very low level misusing their sexuality in different ways. So we're not talking about abuse cases here, that sadly are too common, but on a very low level. I think that sort of skill with sexuality is something I've seen in some of my teachers, which I can really respect. So I wanna bring that in as well. Who else we got? Oh, a couple of master coaches. So Curtis Watkins and Veronica Love. So that's she's the daughter of Julio Olaya from Newfield Coaching. They're two of the best embodied coaches I've ever seen. Both of them can really completely be present with someone and just take them on a massive emotional journey. And there's like the yin and the yang and the going in and out. You know, it's the skill of coaching, there's a lot I could say this, but a lot of it is tuning into people and really listening to them. I think that ability to observe bodies, so like Paul, for example, could look at you and kind of see that your spine was very slightly off, or even your intention was going in one direction. He could look at you and go, okay, your intention's going that way, even if you're leaning the opposite way. So that sort of observational skill is key. And then actually sort of tuning in an empathic way. There's a Buddhist teacher that does games, fun games, and also nonviolent communication called Jayaraja. And he just has this fantastic way of kind of empathically tuning in to the needs of participants in his group. He's another one that brings the cheekiness into it as well. And the yang side, he's quite robust. You know, he's a teacher I hope to get on the show. And I really like, what he brings to it as well, because that mixture of cheekiness and robustness. And, it's partly about personal style, but he's also got the empathy. So if you think of the range of those things, like humour, fierceness, empathy, another one we could add might be something like structure or organisation. There's definitely, even with the free flow and the responsiveness, there's a real place for people who turn up on time and have a plan, And for me, the growth is learning to do that a little bit more, particularly now where I'm at a point where I don't have to. Like, I've got for this podcast a little bit of a plan on an iPad here, and that's part of my kind of learning, even for doing these podcasts. Is like, I can blag it. I'm Irish. I can talk all day, but it's it's actually going to be better if I spend even 5-10 minutes structuring this. And some of the people I've mentioned didn't have that, so I'm not going to name names, but some of these people had something. It's very rare to see all these in one person. You can think of like the 4 Elements model, if you look at the podcast on that. Have I released that yet? If I haven't, I will soon. And the idea of, the earthy structure, the water empathy, the fiery fierceness and passion, people that are passionate about what they do, and the airy kind of like fun and creativity and kind of sense of spaciousness. Some teachers have this way of creating spaciousness around them. This is going to sound fairly abstract, so I could also talk about teachers that have very concrete skills, like operational language is one we talk about. Teachers that actually give instructions of how to do something rather than abstract metaphors or kind of end results, like empty your mind or extend your energy. Teachers that actually have concrete methods and able to convey those. That's, a very concrete skill. That's one I bring my students up on. Not using too much jargon, for example, is another one. Being culturally aware. Like, do you know the difference between British and American English? Like, I've just taught in Sweden. That was quite different from Russia, where I teach a lot. Being aware of some of the cultural variables, like power distance, which is in studies of cultures, is one way of looking at cultures, is how big is the power distance. So in Russia, for example, students wouldn't invite me for lunch and they would make me cups of tea, whereas in Sweden, it's much more casual, much more egalitarian. And there's consequences to that, to how you teach. So I think cultural awareness is one that I've seen in something. Again, American teachers tend to be not so good at that, if I'm honest. Some of the teachers from sort of Switzerland, Holland and places like that are, there. Who else have I got here? Linda Hartley, she's a body mind centering and dance movement therapy teacher, had a very gentle touch, kind of like her style. Testify. So Testify was originally a student of mine from Ethiopia. I lived in the circus with him. I used to see him teaching circus, and he now teaches Aikido. He's like the sort of head Aikido guy in Ethiopia. And, he had a way, what would he do? He was showy, but he was showy in a good way. Like, he knows how to show off to be in service to people. And, that's not a bad thing necessarily. He'd ride around on his motorcycle and he'd have a BlackBerry, and I'm not sure if it even works in Ethiopia at the time, but he'd understand appearance. And it's easy to critique the Instagram stars or whoever it is, but actually knowing how to present yourself in photographs, in presentation, there is something in that, as long as there's real skill underneath it. In Ethiopia, they talk about wax and gold. It's to do with church crosses, and it's metaphor. I won't go into exactly what it means, but the meaning, the underlying meaning, is that there's 2 layers to things, and the gold is like the deep core layer of the quality of what you're doing, and the wax is what covers it, or its presentation. It's how they would protect gold in kind of Egyptian churches from decay and things. I think having a sense of the wax and the gold can be helpful. What else? Oh, Dr. Adrian Harris we had on the show. What I love about him is he's got curiosity. So he's kind of like this magician, eco-pagan guy, and literally a magician, but he's got that quality to him, that archetype. And he will look at students with complete openness and curiosity. Like, it's very easy as a teacher, particularly someone a bit cocky like me, to get into knowing. And then, of course, the learning stops on the teacher's side, and people feel that. But Adrian just is able to, like, keep this sense of, like, complete curiosity. And it's like childlike curiosity. Some of my students got this on training at the moment, actually. It's really wonderful when people have this. And to see it in a teacher who's actually in his 60s, he's a fairly mature guy, is really beautiful. And obviously, Adrian, if you haven't listened to his podcast, his thing is nature. So being able to be tuned into the natural world, realizing how the environment you're in makes a difference. And I've definitely seen that some teachers are better at this than others. It could be like how the chairs are arranged. There's a teacher, Tess Howell, who I used to work with, well, I still do work with sometimes, actually ex of mine as well, get her on the show. Tess has just got this wonderful sense of aesthetics. So she'll like reposition a plant in the room or change the lighting slightly or insist that people tidy up their jumpers, their sweaters that have been thrown on the floor. She just has this the mixture of beauty and order with just enough chaos so it isn't stifling. She's just wonderful at that. Like her use of like flowers, her use of like even very simple things. She can make an altar out of just a few leaves that she finds on the floor. That aesthetic sense. Most of my Aikido teachers just wear like jeans and jumper and shabbily dressed. Who's the guy? There's a guy in Germany I want to get on the show. Sorry, it's late here. I'm tired. His name's eluding me. Daniel. Yeah, is it Daniel? Yeah, Daniel. So he's just got like beautifully dressed the whole time, and that's great. Like why not? Why not? As long as you've got the depth, which he has and Tess has as well, to go with it, then absolutely nothing wrong with that. I haven't mentioned him for far too long actually, but one of the best embodiment trainers I know is Francis Briers, who I've been working with for many years, and we've stopped working together now actually, but he's a very good trainer. I'm trying to think what makes him good, and I think it's like great care for participants, just the mastery of the content. Also, like to work with, I've noticed people that work well with others. So sometimes we have a guest trainer come to EFC and they just sort of do their thing and leave, but they don't necessarily get the bigger context of what they're serving. They're not able to sort of communicate well with the rest of the team. This is what I want, or that what do you want from this session? I think that's really key. Like being the sort of team player. Often we're not in this on our own. And being able to, Frankie will use poetry, he'll use story. I think that's another kind of really beautiful thing. And I guess if I ask what these guys have in common is the ethics part, but there's also self-awareness, right? Like any good teacher knows their strengths, whether it's Phil Smith, the Aikido teacher, or, Rachel Blackman, or whether it's Curtis. They know what makes them a good coach. They know what makes them a good facilitator, and they play to those strengths while being aware of the weaknesses. So for me, it might be like, right, I'm good at being kind of energetic and inspiring people. That's a nice quality to have as a trainer. I'm good at, getting things done, but I'm also aware that sometimes I tend to push people a bit hard. So for me, it's like, my learning edge right now is giving people little lie downs and more breaks and, starting at 10 o'clock and not 8 o'clock in the morning and just kind of easing off a bit, because I know that's a personal tendency I have. And we all have blind spots, of course, but having done some of the necessary shadow work, the kind of therapeutic work, I think helps, as well as just doing the sitting and the meditation and the embodied work. So there's some of the things I appreciate. That sense of knowing your strengths and weaknesses. I was trying to think some of my yoga teachers. So, Jim Tarrant, he has the humour, but he also has just this presence. I'll go to his classes. He's just very, very present from his own practice, which I believe is very diligent. I can certainly see that in him. And there's a way in which he just holds awareness and deepens you into awareness. The whole group can go there, because of that. So he's got that quality. Pete Blackerby trains here. What he has is non-invasiveness, so like a good coach, just bringing people to their own conclusions without forcing it too much, and also just very logical, someone that can really look at things logically without kind of getting too argumentative about it. And Gary Carter, one of my teachers here, he's got a certain charm which I enjoy. And also, one of the things, just very clear, he's very clear, like, okay, what do you want to get from this workshop? It can be simple things like that. Jude Murray, one of my UAP colleagues, is also big on that. She's also big at, one of the things I've seen that it can be overdone by some of the Americans, but being aware of some of the sort of special considerations in the room, whether it's being trauma awareness, which is something I've, studied with Paul Linden, whether it's, Jude's on, and she's quite open about this, on the autistic spectrum, so she's quite aware of people that might not be what's called neurotypical, some of the gender issues. She brings a strong feminist narrative to it, so she can really, I think to be aware that other people may not have your life experience. And I don't want to go into a big kind of, anti-privilege rant, or how people can get really, really sensitive about this these days. But to be aware maybe we can all agree on this, that other people have not had your life experience, whether because you're working class and they're not, whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity, sexuality, to be aware that if I'm teaching gay community in Russia, those guys in the room had a very different experience of maybe their first sexual experiences, or how that, coming out to their family, it's a very different experience. So I think that's a skill, that is a skill that's really worth being aware of it. And again, without being super politically correct, because I actually think that just becomes very awkward, but just more from an empathic and a considered point of view, I would say that one. What else? Not making things shameful. I remember there was Rob Babea, who's a meditation teacher I really enjoy. He had this wonderful quality of presence, wonderful sharp mind. I do value that. But also I remember once I kind of wrote him a note on a silent retreat. I said, look, I'm going nuts. I've just sat down. These beautiful women have sat next to me, and it's really kind of feeling really feisty, really horny. And he didn't make me feel in any way ashamed of that. He just said, well, that's nice, and you can enjoy those feelings, but, don't do anything with that. Don't follow the thoughts. Obviously, don't pursue the people. There wasn't any kind of sense of being, feeling ashamed. And the same when students have angry feelings or whatever it is. It's like being accepting of what is and not judging them for whatever it is, and I was just in Sweden teaching, and people were coming with all kinds of delicate issues, and before we can begin to kind of help them with those issues, whether it was about their marriage or about their weight, body image issues, it had to be this sense first of all of like, I'm not going to judge you for that, you're okay, that kind of basic humanistic frame I think is there. Other teachers, a lot of my students from EFC I can think of that did really like GC exam sessions where I was wanting to kind of learn from them, and it's usually a mix of all these factors we've talked about. More broadly, embodiment teachers like my mum, my sister, is certainly every child I've ever met has been an embodiment teacher in some ways. And you look at the kind of natural posture or breathing of children, for example. So without wanting to sort of romanticize or idealize those things, I think we can learn embodiment and have embodiment teachers who aren't officially that, as it were. I know in doing this I've missed out loads of people that I've studied with who weren't on my mind, particularly today when I made these notes or when I've been speaking through this. So if you're out there and you're an awesome embodiment teacher and I've forgotten you, then I apologise deeply. There's certainly a lot more out there who are excellent teachers, including people that I've personally trained with, some probably quite a lot and I've just forgotten. So please accept my forgiveness. I hope for everyone else this draws out some of the themes so we can move beyond, the things I would like to move beyond. One is just saying my teacher's the best. It's always like when someone says my karate teacher's the best, I'm always like, well, did you search the world to find them? Or did they happen to be the one that's in your backyard? Because if it's the latter, I'm a little bit suspicious of that. So that's the first thing I want to get rid of, is just this idea of like being provincial and saying, my teacher's the best because they're my teacher, as opposed to actually having really looked out and considered that. I think we need to be discerning in the modern world because there's so much out there. There's so much yoga, there's so much dance, there's so many teachers out there that we need to have some distinctions for discernment. And if this podcast is about anything, it's about that actually. That's one of the main themes of this podcast, along with diversity and culture and a few others. Distinctions for discernment is what really we're trying to draw out here. It might be a little interesting exercise actually, is for you to go through your own teachers. If you're listening to this, take 5 teachers and go, okay, what do they have in common? What are some of the things I really like? What is a matter of style rather than a matter of excellence? So it's easy to copy style, whether it be cultural style, copying someone's Japanese accent because they're Japanese, or their teaching style because, that's just what you like, rather than build your actual range. So being able to distinguish style from quality, I think, is important. And actually, maybe drawing out from this podcast some of the things I've said that you think actually you would agree with, or you think are valid in terms of what really makes presence. On EFC, we do this in depth with people. We do this in fun ways. Like we get people to draw the ultimate embodiment teacher, and then we get them to do a little play where they have to do the worst embodiment session ever. That's kind of a fun exercise. You can do that. Like what would be the worst ever embodiment teacher? That's sort of the opposite angle on this. It can be a fun way of teaching this with students. If I think of students that have done really good EFC exams, at the end of EFC they do like a 30-minute exam, and they have to kind of show some embodiment work, but their own style, not just copying us, but their own version of it, combining what they already knew with what they've learned in the year. And, I think one really good one was Mirav. She was an Israeli friend of mine, and she was doula, which is like a hippie midwife, and she combined 4 elements, embodiment work and centering with giving birth. And obviously I don't know anything about giving birth, but she's taking on the principles, an understanding of the deeper principles of embodiment rather than the tricks is definitely one I would add. And she did it in her way, which was sort of Jewish and very feminine. She had her own vibe on it of this sort of strong Jewish woman that helped people give birth. And, she really brought herself to it. And that they're the exams I like, the ones where people bring themselves to it. And you can tell when a teacher's bringing themselves to it, being authentic, I guess you'd say, bit of an overused word, and bring their own culture, their own personality to it, rather than just being a photocopy of their teacher, having that really dull. So, we finished with her as a student rather than all the other teachers. So I hope it's been useful. And as I said, the things you can draw out there from your own teachers might be a fun exercise. And if I've forgotten you, then forgive me. I hope this was useful. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.